Welcome everybody.
Thank you.
So I have either good news or bad news, depending on how you respond to a change. But we're moving quiz 3 to next week. So I had a little computer problem, and we don't have a quiz today. So if you prepared for it and are ready to go, I apologize. Otherwise, I give you a week of reprieve.
Dang it.
And at the end of the class, I kind of took a moment to look ahead how that was going to affect the next 6 weeks. So we've kind of mapped out, I took what's on the schedule on Blackboard, but I mapped it out so that we can kind of look at how that's going to affect quiz 3, 4, and 5 and the various stuff we have going on, because everything starts to get a little busier here as we wrap this up. So that's one update. And then before I get it, working the numbers is a tricky subject, and where again, the thing that I hope to do on an ongoing basis is set up future weeks and continue to give us an understanding of some ingredients and some elements, and then we're going to put them to work as we go down the line. So, and it's also not an accounting class, and I'm not an accountant, but with my career first starting in beer, I still feel like I call it beer math, but it's all the same, whether it's beer or spirits, draft beer, cocktail, knowing your way around the numbers, both directions, to be able to create pricing and to be able to analyze market pricing backwards and either tell somebody what they're making, like a retailer or a wholesaler, understanding how to navigate a pricing conversation at retail, at wholesale, and in your own shop is crucial. So we're working on a specific portion of numbers and math and understanding those relationships that feeds things like profit and loss statements and being able to project either revenue or project gross profit or further. So we're going to bump into those things that are a little more complicated than I'm planning on teaching, because what we're doing is what creates the number that then goes into that next category, that goes into the finance team and goes into elsewhere. I always remember when I was first getting in this business and somebody said, well, what does that cost you to make? And I was in the sales role, and I said, I don't really know. And the person just responded, said, I ran a small business. I didn't know either. And I don't have the business anymore. So there's a stark reality of, if you don't understand what your price needs to be relative to your costs, you don't have to be the finance team or the accountant, but if you're consistently selling something at a price that doesn't bring in the appropriate amount of revenue for the business to run, that will eventually reveal itself to you, and it'll get less and less comfortable further down the line. So again, I just wanted to give you that sort of intro, that we're going to be covering some things that get a little tricky, and then to me, it just feels like you're almost stopping short, like, because we can't necessarily go in there and teach profit and loss and all that stuff and cover everything we're covering. So hopefully that's enough of a preview, and certainly step in and just speak up if we need to back up, or if we didn't cover something, or whatever. So not looking to scare you, just feel like I have this disclaimer I needed to make. So let me get the slides up. Oh, and also before I do that, did anybody have any questions hanging over from last week or up till now before we jump into this? Okay. So pulling from the syllabus itself, these competencies are kind of adjacent. I've sort of inserted a little more of this understanding than might have been outlined before. But in terms of explaining principles of marketing, market segmentation, target marketing, brand positioning, I moved all that to a different branding, marketing, PR week. And we're just talking about pricing. And we're talking about pricing relevant to other pieces of the puzzle. And then the importance of economic and environmental sustainability and social responsibility, you know, that's sort of in here. It's not really what we're covering, other than economic sustainability is really how that competency is in here. So, and again, thinking especially about operations and marketing, marketing and sales are responsible for either setting pricing or informing on pricing and selling the product. And then operations needs to understand what they need and make sure that their costs and prices are in line. I often, whether or not you're one company and one person doing it or not, I see it. I see production selling to sales. Sales then takes it to the market. And my background being in distribution, I found value in doing this even within a pub model, having the brew house sell to the tasting room and having there be an exchange, even if there isn't really one in real life, meaning there's no transaction, having those organized as departments. And so that the pub has a hard cost to their product because they bought it from the production team. That is a very useful organization of resources. And so, because if you're, well, I'm getting into the topic instead of this overview. So we're going to talk about the relationship of pricing to revenue, budgeting, and profitability. We're going to talk about how pricing is structured across the 3-tier marketplace. And then we're going to talk about some mechanism to assess, create, or manage product costs and associated expenses. So we're a lot more on the pricing side than we are costing side today, but we're explaining how that works. So a couple of things, just some sort of terms and venues. This is going to come up a lot. And it comes up a lot in the industry in terms of people will say markup and margin. They don't necessarily attach profit to that. They don't necessarily, it's just important to know the difference between the two, because this gets used in all venues and in slightly different ways. So revenue in general, just recognize that revenue you're talking about which would also be referred to as top line. So top line is coming from the P&L universe, where you're saying, what's the total money you took in? It's not what you made. It's just what was the total. So that seems simple enough, but it's important to point out here that when we talk about revenue, we're talking about top line dollars that are brought in for the goods and services. So some pricing definition in terms. Pricing in general is the cost to purchase the good or service, and that may change. So you may have different prices. Do you have even in a tasting room model, is your to-go beer the same as in-house? Does it cost the same to buy a 12-ounce bottle of beer sitting at a table with your meal as it does to take it to go in a 6-pack? Probably not. So pricing is variable based on which customer is buying it, wholesale, retail, consumer, where they're buying it, and whether there's other things attached to it, freight, deposit, tax. All those things may change here and there. So it's important to understand just from the beginning, there's usually not one price. And that kind of also even reflects that revenue is not always as simple as it seems, because if you're saying how much money are we going to bring in on this brand or from this thing, you've got to roll up the various prices and their volumes to figure out that number, because it's probably not, well, we sell it for $20 a case. So how many cases did we sell? Well, you sold it for that to one customer in one venue, but you sold it for something else in another. And even if they are the same every day, meaning you're not changing your pricing, you're not discounting, you still have different contexts with which it's being sold. So that's just good awareness, and we'll break that down a little bit here as we go. Markup. This is a very important one. Well, these two are very important. Markup is a pricing term that identifies the percentage of cost added to product to generate or generate a selling price. So it's a percentage of cost. So if I'm buying something for $20 and I'm going to mark it up, I'm going to take a percentage of $20 and add it to 20. So if I'm going to do a 50% markup, I'm taking $10, which is 50% of 20, and it's becoming 30. Right? And I put two different ways you can calculate this on there, which the quickest way for me has always been cost times 1 point markup as a percentage. So cost times 1.5 is 50% markup. And then you could also do what I did initially when I was describing it and say, well, I know that 10 is half of 20 already, so I don't need to do the multiplication. I'm just going to add 10 to the cost, which is 20. That's $30. For margin, it's the difference between the selling price and the cost represented as a percentage of the selling price. Okay. So in this case, a $30 selling price, and we had a $20 cost, $30 minus 20 divided by selling price equals margin. So that's going to be 33% here. So selling price minus cost is that $10, but it's divided by the selling price 30 instead of the cost. So it's a relationship. Which relationship are you measuring? That $10 that you made remains the same, and it's 50% of your cost, and it's 33% of your selling price. 33% margin on a 50% markup, same amount of dollars. That makes sense? So, and you can use either one of these. What's important is if somebody's saying, if you're at retail and you're trying to figure out how they're going to price your product, and they say, I make 25%, you need to know which percentage that is. Is that margin or is it markup? And that there are some typical situations that we'll go through, but doing the math on the wrong one can create some confusion. All right, so here's more words. Gross profit margin detail. So this is an example of what we're not going to really drive down into, but understanding that cost of goods, which is also, and I pulled this language from the balance.com, but cost of goods or COGS can be referred to as the cost of sales. It's the actual cost of the product itself. So it's accumulation of the raw materials, packaging products, what it takes to make the thing. That could also be what it takes to buy the thing if you're going to resell it. So this is typically, even though it'll take some work, this can be projected per unit, right? So the cardboard case costs this much, the 6-pack costs this much, the glass costs this much, the liquid and the fermenter costs this much, the bottle caps, all that stuff, the labels, all that stuff is in cost of goods. So you can say, listen, I know it costs me $15 a case to make this thing, so I'm going to sell it for 20 or what have you. What is in operating expenses is the overhead, are the things that aren't inside that product. So the labor, the rent, the heat, the electrical, the CO2, all the things that make the company work that is there and able to make the product and sell, SGA, overhead and labor. Those are things in the operating expenses. So why am I spelling this out? I think as a person with a sales and distribution background, it was always important to understand that gross profit didn't mean profit like profitability. There were more expenses to come out of it. So when you come back from the sale to the consumer and you say, you know, if I had my wholesale cost out there, I knew what I sold it for. Um, but if we had a margin, if we had a target margin, it was typically against the cost of goods, not against operating expenses until we got more sophisticated. So what I said over on the right here is that, you know, why does this matter? Because if you're working on gross margin and say, hey, listen, I need to make 40%, our target is 25, 30%, whatever it is. And if that's only addressing the cost of the product, then you just need that percentage to accommodate that it's going to have more taken out of it. That by the time you're through your accountant, the actual profitability of that is probably more like 6 or 7%, which might be on target, but you should just know that, hey, if I'm dealing with a gross margin target that only is taking out cost of goods, then I need X percentage. If I'm dealing with a net that's accounting for everything because we were able to do all that math, then that's a target that's going to be lower. And as long as you're hitting them and understanding what your target is, then you're going to be on the right path. These are areas that are hard to figure out early in a company or with a small company because you don't have staff figuring out all this stuff. Don't necessarily have a lot of history. So what are all my expenses going to be? I have no idea. So, but this can be a place where there's a big miss. Another, you know, sort of given to me as a joke early in my career, which stuck with me, was always a guiding light, was somebody said, well, you can lose a little bit on every case. You'll make it up in volume. So if you're losing on one case, you're losing more on 10. And so a mistake in pricing can cost a lot, because if it's not uncovered, there's no dinger that goes off and says your price too low, because the operating expenses are just coming in and getting paid. And you don't necessarily know until it reveals enough pain that you uncover it, and that can be really costly. So this is an area that is broad strokes at times, but it's important to pay attention to and find ways to get good at it. One thing I described here at the bottom of operating expenses is that those are difficult to calculate per unit. And, you know, in my history, it was always later on, once the company grew and started to have more expertise and more history, and somebody really doing an audit and finding that out of here, we've determined the amount of labor it actually takes to make a case of beer or this brand of beer, that this brand is different because it's barrel aged and goes through this, you know, figuring out an assigned cost for whiskey aging. Well, it's going to sit in the cellar for 3 years. What does that cost? Well, that's not really clear. You can figure it out. You can assign it a cost, but it takes a lot of work. And in the early stages of company, you're working on other stuff. So these are often calculated more monthly, or even department, so that, hey, I know I need this amount of dollars as my monthly nut to cover all the expenses. So there again, it's a reason where you might be saying your unit price is how you figure out your pricing against cost of goods. And then you're able to say, and in general, I need to have X dollars of cost of goods per month to cover my nut. So that's generating a volume target. So I need to sell so many cases, so many kegs. So again, we're not staying on the expense side very long here, but that's how pricing affects your relationship to expenses, because it's the difference between whether you're profitable or not. Any questions there?
Fred, I think you know, like with this, I'm thinking about, you know, the price of a 4-pack of craft beer, you know, could run, you know, $9, $10, $11. And so I guess I think it would be better if I would back into this thing and say, well, you know, if I can get $10 and I can't really differentiate, you know, we all make real good beer. And, what do I need to do to get these costs in line, in my production and my, the front of the operations, and still make a profit. So, I mean, I think I would back into it, and see what the market pricing is. There's just, I just don't think there's much flexibility in the price of a 4-pack of craft beer.
Yeah, well, there is some, and that's what we're going to get to in the coming slides, is how we look at this. And that's also why I'm saying I want you to be able to go both directions, because you've got to compare it to the market and say, what do I got to do in order to hit this price? Or this product just isn't going to be profitable at that price. So maybe I sell it in the tasting room and not here, or it has to be able to have enough value to get to that next pricing tier. But what you're going to want to be able to do is understand both directions of being able to apply a target selling price and determine what that means and whether or not you could make any money on it, or have a fixed cost and say, I'm going to work my way forward and say what my target price should be is here. And then you can compare those two. And that's when you're really able to be nimble, is when you can look at it from both directions and then find the best solution, which is, we used to have long discussions and then come up with like the general business rule of, well, we either got to, make more or spend less. There's the big business lesson. You can spend a lot of time circling back to realize you got to either sell more or spend less.
Hey, Fred?
Yeah.
Question. Now, wouldn't this be, isn't this like subjective to the size and what your kind of business you're running and what you're doing, to what, like the operating expenses? I'm going on by, me and a friend, we started a business a while ago. It's actually my friend's business, but I was there in the inception of it. And all we did was fix and repair floor scrubbers. That's all we did. And he's still making a damn good business on it. But we had to, it came down to every nut and bolt, and to figure out, in our operating expenses and what we were selling parts for in our service. I mean, is this like on the same thing? You got to track everything. You got to keep tabs on everything you're spending, and then it's depending on the size of how big you want your elephant to be.
Yeah, I think my point is that you have these things whether you're tracking them or not. And so the level of detail that you're able to identify them, they're still happening, right? So whether you track the cost of paper towels, they're still getting spent and coming out of bank account and lumped in to, something like that would be, maintenance, and it's in operating expenses. So it's in the overall spending.
Yeah.
And then the cost of goods is typically has a lot more analysis because what's in there. And how many it takes per unit. So I'm just saying there are areas where we don't always know the answer, but we can generally once you're open a year, 2 years, 5 years, you start to realize, okay, I at least know the rhythm of my operating expenses, that I don't track everything, in there, but I know my averages. So
it took us about a year and three.
Yeah.
Year and a half, year and 3/4 to really get a hold on just what we were doing. We were just,
Yeah. And in that comparison, what it costs to buy a part and resell it to the customer and install it. But what you don't necessarily know is what it took to run the business to get to that point. And so you're able to price on the parts and say, listen, we mark up the parts this amount and our labor is this amount per hour. That's one portion of operating expenses. But everything else, the car payments and the gas and the time and the administration and the computer software, that's all likely going to be averaged for a while. And so you just need to know that, hey, my margin on top of the parts and labor needs to be high enough that I can afford my monthly nut for operating expenses. And the larger the company, the more detailed analysis they have. But these things are happening to any company of any size. They're just might be less smaller numbers, and less detail, but they're still happening.
Fred,
Yes.
yeah, I got a question. That first batch of beer you make, I mean, that it's extremely expensive because you've got all your
Exactly.
capital costs and all your rent and
Exactly.
yeah. So I mean, it may be $1 million for the first batch, but I mean, do you like divide that up and do you take like 5 years of the cost of equipment and sort of like space that out per batch over time, or?
Yeah, and that's the part that we're not covering, and
Okay, okay.
whether or not that should be looked into as whether it should, but accounting and amortization and all that
Okay.
stuff is really another category of sort of business math
Okay.
that we're not covering. But yes, that's exactly right, and that's other liabilities and other things in a profit and liability sheet are going to be accounting for paying off debt, and all that. And there again, our lesson here is just that the margin that we're targeting, that's this base gross margin, has to cover a lot of things, including the investment in the business, the acquisition of property and equipment. And we're not going to be able to do all the math. We're just going to know that that's why we have a margin up here. It's so that there's enough left over to pay that other stuff and then still have some left over at the end of the year.
Okay.
And even our net, there's companies that may not, I think these are phrases that get confused, like, well, we didn't make any money for the first 5 years. Somebody saying that is not necessarily meaning they didn't bring any money in and they didn't have a gross margin. They're saying it got spent on investment in the company. So if their net margin was like actually even was 0, but they paid all their bills and they paid all their debt and they paid all their labor and all their cost of goods, they brought in money and they spent money, they didn't have net margin profit to at the end of it all, but they still made product and were in business and had all their stuff taken care of. So that's one example. That's a really broad overview, but just recognizing, and I should have put gross and net in here, but gross margin is typically just subtracting cost of goods. Net margin is subtracting the rest of it, which would include operating expenses and other expenses like liabilities.
Hey, Fred?
Yes.
There's an old saying, and my father used to do it. My dad had numerous businesses, and he always said, pay yourself first. What's your take on that? He said, always give yourself something. It always makes it work better, even though you're losing money, if you are losing money or if you're breaking even or whatnot. Your take on that? I always thought, like when me and my buddy had this business, we paid ourselves first. We didn't get paid handsomely. We had enough to buy a cheap 6-pack of beer, but it gave us a fuzzy good feeling that, at least we were doing something, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that comes down to strategy and preference and planning. And so to me, I love the phrase, plan the work and work the plan. So if you've budgeted either way, if you budgeted and said, my business plan, I'm positioned to where I don't need to take a salary for a year, then but I have budgeted for a salary or for being paid in year 2 and 3, then that year of not getting paid was in the plan and it was accommodated. And one, you're not surprised and going broke while you try to keep the company alive. And then on the other hand, if that's not available and you say, I look at it as not necessarily just pay yourself first, but work the plan. And so if you're representing a lot of labor to make something happen and it's not accounted for in either real spending or budget spending, well, then you don't have the whole picture captured and you're not actually making what you think you're making because you took out part of the machine that's making it work is all your labor. So I think it can create not paying a working, a working owner who's integral into the process moving forward. it's not representative of the actual numbers if you're doing that. So even if, let's say, a company comes in, these are just different examples. If a company is unable to make payroll and the owner wants to say, I'm going to skip getting paid so that I can pay my staff, then the best way to do that would be to move that forward as a debt, so that in the math, when you look at those months, your labor and your pay is represented. It just wasn't distributed. Right. And so this starts to get sort of in the outer reaches of my accounting skills, but the idea of logging that as an expense and not necessarily delivering the check is available. And then you could also recoup that later when there's cash in the business. So I think not identifying payment if it's an owner that's not working a position, it's different. Then their investment is only expecting to recoup distributions from profit. But if you're working a position, if you're the brewer, you're the manager, you're putting in hours towards the resulting revenue, then you want it in there from a data point of view, if nothing else, because that's what it takes to run the business. And absent that, you'll have a false sense of expense. That's too low. Does that answer that? And everybody's got a different opinion on that, but whether it's you or somebody else, unaddressed sacrifice will eventually cost morale. So if it's addressed and you're doing it and you can, and everybody feels good about it, that is sustainable. But if even if you're doing it to yourself or something, if you think about, well, how would another employee feel if they're doing all this work and not getting paid? Well, it really depends on the relationship. Volunteers do it all the time and are happy. So, but if somebody's not a volunteer and they're getting treated like one, then it goes south in a hurry. So, all right, moving on. So I got fancy again with some of these boxes. So I just wanted to talk about how pricing changes as you go from tiers and the different categories you're going to need. So for the producer, selling wholesale, you need to reflect differences in state, which might have different taxes, different regulations, and freight. So, and I was moving fast, so this is, we could spell freight better. But anyways, wholesale pricing is going to also be a different pricing than what you sell in your tasting room, for instance. But these are both prices being paid to you, because the consumer is paying for a glass of draft beer or a cocktail in your tasting room, but they're not going to pay at the same price that you sell to a wholesale, because and especially for to go, this will get explained the most in to go, is that if you want your 6-pack on the shelf in your tasting room to be even with the marketplace, right? So if you don't want to undermine the shop down the street who's selling your product, and if you want the consumer is out getting it off the shelf to have a similar pricing experience at your place than they do at the retailer, well, then that retail bought it from a wholesaler who bought it from you, and everybody needs margin. So clearly your price to the wholesaler, which we'll show this more detailed way, is going to be lower than your price to consumer, because you want your price to consumer to be similar to an avenue where they had there are many things attached to it along the way: freight, handling, salespeople, store. So these are different prices you'll have, and that's for a bottle and draft. Then you add cocktail to it, and so you have the price of your gin. You understand what that cost you, and you can even understand what it costs you to move across the floor and engage the state if you're in Michigan. but now you're adding ingredients to make a cocktail, and you're adding a bartender. So your cocktail pricing has got to engage and reflect different things than just the cost of your spirit. And again, you're going to pay for, you're going to charge a different amount for an ounce and a half of booze in a glass over the bar than you are going to charge for 16 of those inside a bottle with a cork when they take it to go. We understand this as consumers, that it's a much lower price off the shelf in bulk, let's say, than it is when you're being served. And so we've got to understand how to navigate those different prices. Then tier 2, the distributor. So these are identifying sales actions from the tier, meaning all the orange boxes with tier 1 are sales the producer made. So the wholesale is the sale to tier 2, the distributor. The distributor is selling what we would call, well, I guess it's not true for both these boxes, but I put PTR there because I want to start teaching some acronyms. And PTR is price to retailer. So they're going to have a price per brand, per package to the retailer. Now, the sub distributor is not PTR, so I should organize that a little differently. But I was thinking about what are the different prices a distributor has. They could have volume discounting, which I didn't put on here, and it's not here in Michigan. But sub distributor is also something to be aware of. So if you were going to sell product to one distributor and then they were also going to make product available to other distributors to pick up from them. So like if I had a distributor in Detroit and they were going to sell from their big order, they were going to sell little bits to a distributor in the Thumb. We would have to have a discussion of what are you charging to sell off your floor to this distributor, because it can't be retail pricing. And we won't go into that a lot, but it's an example of different prices that they would have at the distributor. So then the retailers who bought the product from the distributor, their price is called PTC, which is price to consumer. So you have on premise where they're selling glasses of beer or glass of cocktail. I guess you don't call it a glass. They're either selling cocktails or glasses of beer or bottles. And there again, we have the same thing we explored in the tier 1 tasting room and to go, is that you're paying a different amount for the on-premise pricing because they're paying, this is where there's often that some uninformed non-industry member saying, well, I could get this bottle of wine for $10 in the store. What the heck am I paying $25 for it in the restaurant? Well, there's a server, there's insurance, there's operating costs, there's the table and the chair you're sitting on, there's the experience, so there's a whole lot more into serving it by the glass, and they're doing it in order to have a margin. So there's going to be a price difference there than a shelf full of product. Nobody's opening it. You're picking it off, putting it in your cart and taking it out. So those are different prices. I put pack size and off premise because here the package that was sold to the distributor is now often changing, right? So my pricing to the distributor was per case. Off premise, you're talking about, well, what kind of case? Did I sell you 12 22-ounce bottles that are individually sold? Did I sell you 4 6-packs of cans or 6 4-packs of cans, etc.? So now our estimated pricing from retail is going through a subdivision of pack size. So now we're talking 6-packs or 4-packs or bottles instead of cases. Now they might also have a case price, but the tradition here is that our original unit has now been subdivided. Same goes for spirits there, but less so. There's typically less divisions, meaning I sold it by the case to the distributor and the store is selling it by the bottle. But there are examples of co-packs where we put a glass in the box with the bottle, or we're selling a 2-pack, or there's cocktails to go now. So there's still other variations in the spirit world, but it's at its base less complicated. All right, any questions there? I'll just address this last point, which is, what margin or markup that you want or that you need. That all depends on the venue. These are all different venues, what I'm calling venues, the volume and the marketplace. So what Frank was saying is that, listen, if I want to sell it for $12 a 6-pack, but the going rate is 10, I'm going to have to figure out whether I'm just going to buck the trend and hope for the best, or whether I need to adjust or accommodate, or whether there's a fit. So the marketplace will determine kind of the viability of your pricing, but the venue is going to change your strategy and your structure, and volume also will affect your target margins. If you're selling 1,000 cases of something, you don't want to be losing money, but you could make a lower margin and still be doing well than something that you have very limited supply of or limited sales of, which goes back to that other point. That first case is really expensive, but if something's really moving, you might be able to live with a lower percentage, which could still generate more dollars in the long run. But there again, volume is an elusive muse. And so, surely you could make less on this at this volume. If you go too low, then you could argue, what was the point? There are instances too, it often is regulated in the beer where in Michigan, spirits have a minimum markup. So the retailers are bound to a specific percentage, a specific price that's set by the state that says you can't sell below this. Retailers for beer, if I got this right, they're not allowed to sell below cost. So they can't choose to lose money on beer. And you would ask, why would they ever want to? Why do you need a rule there? The reason is because a retailer could choose to do what they call a loss leader. So I'm going to lose money on beer to get people into my grocery store and make money on everything else they buy. Or I'm going to lose money on this one beer because I want to be the lowest price in town. So I'm going to lose money on that, but then they're going to buy the rest of their beer or spirits here while they're here. So retailers can, and so you think about the fact that Meijer and Costco and Sam's Club sell at lower prices than typically than independent retailers, but they're not allowed to sell below cost. And that is a regulation is going to change by state. Some states they are allowed to do that. So anyways, just wanted to put out there that it's all conditional. So being able to evaluate and being able to understand where you draw the line in either direction is really helpful in terms of creating a pricing plan. And without a pricing plan, this is one of the things that you could say, well, we'll figure that out when we get there. Without a pricing plan, you can't forecast revenue, right? What are you going to charge your wholesaler for your kegs? What are you going to charge for glasses, or what are you going to charge your pub for the kegs? Either way, if you're doing a business plan, at some point you got to say, how many barrels of beer are we going to do? How many gallons of spirit are we going to do? what's that going to translate to in sales? Are we selling to wholesale? Are we selling to retail? Are we just selling in our tasting room? And how many do we expect to sell in a month times what equals revenue? And so without having a pricing plan, your whole planning kind of stops, or is missing a key element of, here's what I think we can actually bring in the door over the first couple years, any year. So we've got to know the terrain in order to know our pricing, and we got to know our pricing to forecast our revenue.
Fred, is the minimum pricing over cost, does that apply to distributors, wholesalers, and producers too, or just the retailer? Or is there, some maze that you have to go through to figure that out?
That's a great question. Spirits, I'm pretty sure it applies. Well, I know it applies. Because in Michigan, it's the state run, there's a generator, the price. So it's not a rule, it's a sort of automatic pricing that then is the same as a rule. That's a good question with beer. I'm pretty sure that that's universal, that they can't sell below cost either. I would need to look it up actually, because I'm thinking about some examples in history, like if there's beer that's going to go out of code, can they deep discount the beer if they're closing it out? And I don't want to quote that reg since it's been a long time and I don't know what it is right now, but I would say overall, definitely at retail, wholesale is rare. And if it happens, there might be some way they're doing it so that it satisfies the law if it is the law. So we'll have to look that up though. All right. So here's a little summary of part of what we were just talking here. I started to lay in PTR and PTC. There's a whole bunch more, especially if you're in the wholesale environment. So thought we'd just go through them. FOB is called freight on board. This is sort of shorthand for prices to wholesalers. So a wholesaler would ask, send me your FOBs. What's your FOB? They're asking for your price to them, but freight on board is saying that the freight and other logistical expenses are on the truck, meaning they're going to be added to that price. So this, another way people would say this is FOB my dock, which is sort of redundant if you understand the phrase, but they're saying you got to pick it up. And if there's taxes after it, that's on you. So it's not their total cost. Now, there are some manufacturers that decide to get into trucking and either contract it or buy their own trucks. They say, well, I got people buying less than full truckloads. So if I just route the orders, I can sell 3 wholesalers in one truck and I can save. My overall market price will be lower because I found savings in combining these wholesalers who weren't working together as a group. I was just delivering a product to them. So if you took on freight, this is less common, but is out there. Less common as a phrase and less common as a service. If you were still leaving taxes and their other logistics to them, but if you were going to roll in freight to your pricing, you would be saying CIF. Laden, this is a very common term, and this means that after all those additions, so if they're paying an excise tax, if they're paying freight, this is laden, meaning that on their warehouse floor, this is what the distributor is assuming this product cost them. Not what you charged them, but what it cost after it traveled and satisfied any other requirements like tax. So laid-in pricing is what they're going to calculate their pricing from. right? So when they're figuring out what it costs them so that they can figure out their margin, they're not using FOBs, they're using laden. So then their cost, well, their price, so the wholesale sets a price that has a margin, or that is marked up above their laden pricing, and that's PTR, price to retailer. So the retailer's buying it from the wholesaler at what we would say is PTR. PTC is price to consumer. So pretty obvious when you spell it out. This is what the consumer's buying it for from the retailer, at least in this. These are less common. I wouldn't necessarily say PTC in a pub setting, but well, I probably would, but not everybody would, because we're still talking about what is that shelf price. I suppose that's another term that somebody might use here is shelf price. But it relates to draft as well. And then MSRP. So I was working with a brewery recently and they were using MSRP, and I was sort of unpacking the difference between what I thought with PTC and MSRP. I didn't use MSRP very often, but what I've identified is that that's really the target. So if, let's say you were selling to 10 different wholesalers and you had a target price, shelf price of $10.99. Well, your actual PTC across those regions may not all be $10.99. So I see PTC as sort of either projected per region or actual, meaning it's, and then the MSRP is more universal target that you might be above or below at in actuality. And you're not going to change that much. That's less of a calculatable. It is able to be calculated, but it's just not changing as much. It's sort of overall, I see this product as a $10.99. That's MSRP. Doing the math at a wholesaler and realizing like, hey, well, this region is going to be at $10.49 because they have less freight, and this other region is going to be at $11.29. That might be things that you accept and put in the plan as a PTC. Okay, so hopefully you can all see this. This is an example of a pricing worksheet. And when we get into distribution and doing forecasts, we'll probably do some more, like it's strange to me to bring this up on a slide instead of going through the spreadsheet and teaching the Excel skills and formulas. But again, it's sort of a battle of priority of deciding which things we're going to go into great detail on. But this is an example, and this is a layout from a method, an Excel spreadsheet that I used for, I don't know, 15 years with variations. So over here you have the brand and package. You're going to determine, what it is, because obviously different packages are going to cost different amounts. And you could also do this per brand. I decided to take a snapshot of basically one category of brand. So this is similar to like tiered pricing, one could say, but saying, okay, here, these 4 brands are all the same family, and we're going to charge the same amount for them. So you have your FOB manufacturer. A lot of times people would put their city in place of manufacturer, because you're just on the sheet, you're telling somebody analyzing their pricing where they got to get to. So then estimated wholesale additions is saying, here you don't necessarily, if you're preparing for a meeting, if you're pitching this, you don't know these answers until you ask them. Hey, what do you estimate for freight? Oh, well, how many miles, blah, blah, blah. Are we buying truckloads? Are we buying pallets? They'll give you a number, and then you can calculate the rest of these. So, oops, And I can show you that when necessary, but generally speaking, you get a price per pallet, and then how many cases are on a pallet, how many kegs are on a pallet. That can vary slightly. It's usually 72 cases to a pallet and 16 half barrels or 46 barrels. So that's what that equates to in freight. And then tax. Now in Michigan, the brewer's paying the excise tax, but I wanted to show you this column when a state is assigning that tax to the distributor. So, and I didn't really vet these prices for current relativity, but I just wanted to show you the difference between FOB and laden. So if we follow that case of 6-packs, $20 plus $1.37 is $21.37. So the wholesale math is then dividing from laden. Now, in order to calculate margin, selling price minus cost divided by selling price is in this cell in the spreadsheet. So I've determined, which of these things are where I put things in and which of these things are calculating. And in this case, I'm able to toggle my wholesale price and find a wholesale margin that's appropriate. Now, the target was 25% margin for wholesalers is for a long time. This is sort of high, I would say. This is sort of the math you do is typically they shoot more towards 30 these days. So 33 means you could bring that wholesale price down and keep working until you find something. So then over here, these are going to get into our next section. But how do I know if this is a good wholesale price if I'm not doing math to see what it does to retail? So PTR is this wholesale price, in this case, divided by 4. Because there's 4 6-packs in a case, and my unit for the retail is a 6-pack. Now, if I want to figure out single bottle sale, or if it was 6 4-packs instead, then I'm just going to change that division. But this is giving you, the PTR is giving you the retailer's cost. And so now I can plug in, well, what does it look like if they charge the consumer $10.79? Well, that's going to generate a retailer margin of 25.86. Is that enough? Question for the marketplace and the retailer. Typically, you see retailers averaging, looking to have 25%. They might go to 20 for a program or a mover or display or something like that. But if you're trying to test whether or not your wholesale price is getting you the target that you want, being able to work on this spreadsheet and try different scenarios is really helpful. Also, there's a reality that my price to consumer might be different 5 states away, where in a high tax state. And this goes down to strategy. The decision comes down to strategy. The knowledge and is understanding what you're doing. That if you want to keep the same price to consumer in a market that has higher dollar amounts in freight and tax, you're going to have to lower your FOB. And then you could have a uniform price to consumer across the country. But you're subsidizing the freight and tax in your lowered FOB. So you're making less money on the beer that goes to California than the beer to Michigan if you want them both to cost the same on the shelf. Or you're asking the wholesalers to make less margin there than they do here. Somehow or another, that freight and tax is going to be paid for. And it's going to come out of somebody's margin. So that is a strategic question, is the beer that traveled further and cost more to get to the consumer, should it cost the consumer more? Or should that cost be paid by wholesale and manufacturer? Strategic answer if you are paying attention. It's just an answer made by the marketplace if you're not paying attention, or that freight is paid for by the consumer because their shelf price goes higher. Okay, so I digress. The A and the B here is just an example of how I like to work with this, is that I like to see two prices so that I can experiment. And the point being here that I can see what 1149 gives for margin, and I can see what 1079 gives for margin. And if I want to leave one like A as my target that I'm going to try and get to, I can try some different things in B. And I can also be putting this sheet, I could finish it. I usually leave A and B. So again, you could sort of see some retailers need more margin than others. So I'm not saying it's always these percentages that I would leave it at, but I would have two scenarios in play. So you can see here, I simulated having a lower FOB of $1 for a 12 pack. It's not always available. Usually 12 packs are designed, they're from the big producers, they're intended to be a lower priced item. You get a 12 pack for less than it costs for 2 6-packs. For small producers, that is sometimes difficult to do. But anyways, in this case, you've now got a $20 laid in. We lowered the price and we lowered their margin a little. That's almost 30%. That's probably doable. Now you've got a $19.99 shelf price to consumer for a 12 pack, which is less than 2 6-packs. And the retailer's making 27.5 points. So that's the way you would use this sheet, both to find these prices and to express them with your wholesaler. Another important note that I think I'll add to this slide. Hold on one second while I write that note. It's very important to recognize that you're not allowed to dictate wholesale pricing. You're not allowed to tell them what they're going to sell your product for. However, you're able to discuss it. So it's just very important to recognize that once they buy your product, it's theirs. And if they want to make 35 points, they're going to. And you can be upset about it, but you can't legally force them to change that price. So that will come more in the strategy will come more in the sales and distribution side. But the reality is, why would you have this sheet? Why would you be trying to figure this out? Because if you have a good working relationship, you're seeking a price that everybody's happy with. And the more you know, the more you're able to come in and say, here's my target price to consumer. Here's what I think would be a great price for you. And they might say, well, that's too low. I need another $1. Okay, let's put that in. So let's see what that does. You would be having this discussion and going back and forth so that you have a pricing plan that everybody's endorsed and knows how to sell from. So that's the idea. And it was just important for me to make that caveat that this word suggested is not there on accident. Because if you forget to say suggested, most times people are going to be understandable. But if you were unaware of that law and you said you're going to sell it for this or else, you've now broken the law. So kegs. So here's a little trick, which we'll talk about probably some more Excel skills when it gets to distribution. So some of these average prices might be a little dated too. But anyways, if you're selling a keg for $104 and it has freight of $450, tax, you got to lay it in here of $112.48. Then that $152 keg to retail is making the wholesaler 26 points. That might be low, but we're going to work with it for now. Because the point is just understanding how these things move. And it might be fine. 26 points is pretty good. In the day of craft beer, specialty wholesalers, they're going to want that up a few points. But anyways, you see that now what I've done here, and we'll get to a draft calculator later, I have created a PTR that is the cost of a 16-ounce pint. Because the retailer for draft, I suppose there's off-premise stores selling kegs, but the main pricing I want to check here is that's going to work on premise. And so I've done the math for a 15.5-gallon keg, and I'll show you this formula later to determine that at $152, the Excel spreadsheet will tell me that that's $1.23. So if I sell it for $5 a pint, I'm making 75.48%. Restaurateurs are typically looking at cost instead of margin, so that you would be able to invert that and say, so that's basically a 24.5% beverage cost. And if you want a scenario number 2, if you sell it for $6 a pint, you're at 20.5 beverage cost. So this would help you understand, is your keg price from FOB through laden, through PTR and PTC, is it hanging together and giving you the target that you want? And there again, you can work this both directions. If $5 is the absolute, then you're going to work backwards and see what's the highest FOB that can still give you a satisfactory $5 pint. And we'll cover more strategy later, but 6 barrels is just the same thing, divided differently for keg size. And there's typically, you're getting a less good cost per ounce on a 6 barrel because of the cost of materials and handling. But you can still see how it works out. So they're making less money buying 6 barrels, but if that's satisfactory to them and they have an advantage in using the small kegs, you're able to point it out. And or if this isn't going to work, then you could adjust your FOB as long as you do it in a way that it's enough money. All right, so that's wholesale pricing, acronyms, and pricing worksheet. Does anybody have any questions here? Great. All right, so talking about package to go, I basically just, and we're talking about tier 1 and tier 3 together. So meaning anybody that has a shelf where customers pull the beer off. What I did here is I just got rid of the freight and tax because here you're just kind of dealing with this pricing as your pricing. Now, I think that if I'm going to go back here for a second. So these margins have gone up, obviously, because if I'm in a tasting room and I have my brewery FOB, there's no wholesaler cost in here. So that 25 to 30 points of margin isn't here. But if I'm the retailer as a brewery, if I say, well, I'm going to make the traditional margin, but I'm going to have the cost of a wholesaler. Well, I'm going to be selling really inexpensive beer, and that's going to upset the marketplace. So here's an example of I need to charge traditional retail prices so that when somebody sees it in another store, I call it protecting your price point, is that if I sell it for $8 at my place, but it costs 11 somewhere else, nobody's going to buy it at 11. So if I want 11 to be an accepted price and the value of the beer, I need to represent that in my place. And I need to understand that my target margins are different. So I would start to adapt and either figure out a system where I understood this margin and could apply it to new products, new tiers, or uh, what I like to do as a distribution person was I would actually sell from production to the pub at wholesale pricing. And that's still, um, oh, I'm sorry. I would sell to the pub at FOB, so they'd have a cost here. So they'd be acting like a wholesaler. They're still going to have a retail margin better than the uh, retailer, the traditional retailer, but not absent. And that's really what I did here. So sorry to go back there. I just had to square myself for a second. This FOB is still less than what a retailer would pay for the product from a wholesaler. But if you didn't create FOBs and you don't charge your tasting room them, they're just getting beer from production. There's no cost identified other than how much does it cost to make that batch of beer. That makes sense? And that's what a lot of people do. And they might have figured out what it costs to make a batch of beer and what a pint costs, but they're not necessarily documenting that transaction. They're just selling it by the glass from the batch. And so especially if you have wholesale business and a tasting room, you already have a pricing structure. You may as well start determining a rhythm. But anyways, this is an example of package to go beer. And now the next thing here, let me know if you can't read that on the screen. I can zoom or something, but draft calculator is valuable in both tier 1 in your own tasting room and in tier 2. I'm sorry, tier 3. So this is valuable in figuring out pricing by the glass based on keg prices. So in this, I've sort of cut out a calculator that typically has more than one column available, so you can compare brands. But this was what's important for us now, is that you have the brand and you have the price to retailer. So then you have your keg size that creates, you have to know how many ounces that is. And you're able to do the math. This spreadsheet will do it for you, but you're basically taking that price divided by the ounces, and you have 6.5 cents per ounce. If you're serving a pint, that means I made these orange just because they're key items here, is that now you know what a glass of beer costs. Then you know what you're going to charge for it. You know how many servings there are per keg. So you can determine either to your own math, if you're trying to calculate how much, you can either calculate revenue or you can calculate gross profit, whichever way your structure is asking for. This is helpful for a tasting room to determine those numbers, but it's also really helpful to sell to an on-premise retailer to be able to say, I need you to understand what you're going to make for each glass of this beer that you sell, and I can compare it to other products in the marketplace. So you're making $4.95 a glass in this setting, which is $614 a keg. And later we can do the comparative math. This is just teaching structure. But for instance, this is a tool where you can demonstrate that you're making a lot more per keg for craft beer than you are for domestic light beer. They're getting it for a lot less and they're selling it for a lot less. So that's a case where somebody might be selling a ton of it and they're not losing money, but we can use this to sell as well as forecast and compare to costs. So then the bottom half of this is just sort of ways that you can see how this helps. This is sort of built as a retail sales tool, but it could help you in forecasting as well. That if you say, so, how many kegs a week do you think you're going to do? Well, by the way, that means that this handle is going to make $1,800 for you a week and a month and a year, et cetera. And then showing them their beverage cost as a percentage of sales, which is a restaurateur method, and then your keg sizes. So that's an example of looking at pricing both on premise and off premise, which is in tier 1 and tier 3. Any questions there? Yes, Hannah.
What about losses? I know that if you're selling to someone, you don't have control over how their staff are going to pour beers or what kind of profit saving systems they might have in place. But is there like a standard percentage that you can factor in there? Or I don't know. I was just wondering about, standard losses when you're calculating all this.
Yeah, there's different ways people address it, and of course, as a sales tool, it's less common to address it in a sales tool because you're saying, well, I can't calculate your waste. There's lots of snarky answers to that, but you could do that in servings per keg. You could basically account for that by changing any one of these numbers that you want, saying, hey, if there's an ounce of loss per glass, then I'm going to say a serving size is 17 or 16 and a half. That would accommodate it. But there again, you could also just say, I know that I need this beverage cost because that accounts for loss. So I'd rather, one person might say, I want this to be exact to the intended serving size, and I will just have a target margin that is large enough to accommodate our overall waste. And there's something to be said for that. But either direction would go too. Draft beer waste is often not a product of rolling it into pricing can make some assumptions that leaves a problem instead of saying, how much are you wasting per glass? Because perhaps your draft system needs to be addressed, right? So like you go either direction. If you really want to be robust in your budgeting so that you account for it, there's just some unintended consequences at times, which is, so now we don't worry about it. But that's sort of my pragmatic side speaking up. You could account for that in any one of those areas. And I would add that it's relative, meaning as long as you do it for all the brands or all the scenarios in the same way, you're not going to end up with a comparison that's off because you accounted for waste in one version and you didn't in another. That could trick you down the road. So I think that's probably why I just do the straight serving size divided by the keg size. I think I just adopted it as I know which way I do it. But I've certainly had retailers that did it in different ways. All right. Anybody else? So I've got,
No.
What's that?
Hey, Fred, I could see that if you were doing an event outdoors and it's warm and you're wasting beer because of keg issues, that pouring beers carefully outside, there's going to be more waste than carefully pouring them in your tasting room. So I mean, maybe you could work in a waste factory. Well, we don't make money when we sell our beer outside. I don't know. So.
Right. Well, and so what we're saying here, this is a tool to be used to establish pricing. And in this case, it's also establishing gross profit. So really, as long as it would depend on which setting I'm using it for, in terms of how loose I might be with that. So if the pricing is set, you're not going to charge different amounts for event than you are for regular day. You're really adjusting the amount of profit you expect, and it doesn't need to be zero. So you could adopt a column of this draft calculator that says events. And you know what? I only expect to get 100 servings out of a keg in an event. What does that look like? So you can you could create scenarios on different yields. And that pragmatic advice is just saying, one should still be able to be pretty efficient at an outdoor event, but yes, it might be less than your indoor glycol chilled system. So if you are projecting margin, then creating a bunch of scenarios makes a lot of sense. Your pricing is likely more set annually or at the creation of a product. And so it's just, you're going to want to test that and have it change less per conditions. Well, per changing conditions. It changes per venue, like customer type, but you're not going to be able to. So it depends on who you're selling to and what the scenario is. But in general, you're talking about adopting your expectations for margin versus changing the price. Just clarifying that. And I think that's totally reasonable. And understanding all this stuff and understanding how to create this column and multiple columns gives you an ability to assess different scenarios and then put that into your planning and budget. So I expect to do 100 kegs a year at events and 100 kegs a year in the pub, and I make 80% of the margin at the events that I do in the pub. That plus that equals my keg revenue for these two venues, if you're talking about tasting room. Does that answer that? So, and again, just to reiterate, this particular week, we're just really putting all the elements out there so that you can understand these different terms, the different the different places they show up, and the different directions you can go in terms of using this math. And we're going to put them to work further when it comes to sales and distribution and forecasting. And then that's going to be fed into the business plan in terms of trying to create some revenue expectations. But you can't really create revenue or profit expectations if you don't understand how to price the product. And again, these prices are one price for one type of product. You might have the price that the product you want at this price, a specialty item that you want twice the price, high gravity, specialty beers, rare beers. If you're talking about spirits, all this apply. We're going to do a cocktail math in a second. In the spirits, pricing is really similar. The method, the math is all the same. So I didn't put one up because all that changes is the pack size and the division and whether or not there's a different tax rate, et cetera. But the column relationship of FOB, laid in, PTR, PTC, all is the same for spirits as it is for beer. So if you understand this terrain, then you're going to be able to pull things apart, put them back together and say, this one's more expensive. And after it goes through the network, it's going to be this much on the shelf. And if any of you are interested in doing spirits, there is if you go to MLCC, I will try to download it as well, but the MLCC has a pricing calculator for distilleries. So you put your price in it, and then it tells you how much you're paying to 3 different funds and what your minimum retail price is and what they pay you. So that's a spreadsheet you get from the state. So anyways, this is the terrain, and we'll figure out some different ways to use that. And that's a great example. Anybody else? All right. So this cocktail slide brings up a sheet I haven't used in a while. And but I use these for events, and I did this per drink, and then I had batched price as well. But this is also a really helpful tool to bring to a bartender or a bar owner who's not, usually they're saying, I mean, there's a lot of people who look at the marketplace and say, listen, it's $10 for a cocktail or $6 for a cocktail, and they might have call and top shelf prices depending on the era or whatever, but they don't always like do the math on cocktails. Well, if you start doing craft cocktails and making your own, juice and syrups, and it can get expensive in a hurry, and you need to understand, how do I price it? And what does it make that up? So I have a larger spreadsheet, which I can share, that I just populated every time I created a new cocktail, especially for events, where I would put the products in here, and I had some estimations for what things cost. And here is where I would get this per ounce cost is down here. So a 750 of Knickerbocker cost $21.20. That must have been our in-house price. That's 84 cents an ounce. So if I put these ounces up here, it turns out here. So you can do this even with stuff that you're not making. So what does it cost to buy a bottle of bitters, etc. And I didn't really vet this a whole lot, but this gives you, this is what the drink costs. If I want a 25% beverage cost, then I need to charge $7.53. And then you'd have
Hey.
options. Do I want this to be a $7.50, $7.50, or $8? Well, I know where the target landed, and now I can make a judgment call on whether to go up or down, change ounces, change ingredients, what have you.
I got a question, Fred.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it was already answered. I'm not sure, but I see how you're like in the last slide too, with the cost of the price of the beer, and this with the price of the drink. Where is there somewhere where you're factoring in the like the operating costs of everything else that goes with it, or
No, and that's part of what I was explaining with
is
the
that the percentage?
first slide. This is a gross margin based on cost of goods only.
Okay.
So, and a bar owner typically says we operate on a beverage cost of 25%. They're not counting rent or any of those operating expenses. They're saying costs of physical things for the drinks should be 75% of the total price. And I should probably add that to the first slide, which is we have margin, we have markup, and then you have cost. And restaurateurs work in cost. Retailers can work in margin. They speak in margin. Sometimes they work in markup, meaning I know to make 25%, I need 33% markup. So they get interchangeable. And I should probably add to that first slide that on-premise tradition of what's your beverage cost, what's your food cost. And that's the percentage related to the selling price that equals the cost. Yes, is there a question?
No, yep, that does.
Yeah, I got a question. Hey, depending on where you get your lemons,
Yeah.
they can be quite expensive. I
Yeah.
mean, they're $1 a piece, $1 a piece grocery. So lemon wheels could add 2 or 3 cents to your drink.
Yep.
So
Yeah, and I don't have that represented here because I was a lazy event bartender. But this is an example of where you'd put that in. And you can change this to whatever you want in terms of, if you get good at a sheet like this or make it even your own style. This was just what started to work for me. And was especially important if I was going to delegate to anybody and say, here's what we're doing, and here's how it should work. And more importantly, here's what you should charge for it. But and yeah, this doesn't account for all of the things, even in the gross margin. I mean, it doesn't account for glassware or things like that. So even an event point of view, this is still a very simplified gross margin of ingredients, selling price minus ingredients. Well, it's really the other way around. It's saying ingredients calculated to a projected price that would give me the identified margin that I need. And one of the reasons that one of the reasons restaurants, I think, use beverage cost instead of margin is because 75% margin seems, well, this wouldn't be 75% margin, it'd be more, but that seems like a lot. And so this is both simple and appropriate. But you can see the difference between $1.88 and $7.53 is a lot more than other scenarios. And there's a lot more operating costs involved. So this is sort of a real life example of what I was saying, is that knowing that you have a very simplified gross margin math of only a portion of your total universe costs, have a target margin that's prepared to accommodate for those additional costs. Because the bar owner in this setting, they're not putting that whole $6 in their pocket. They're just knowing, I need $6 in order to run this business, because 5 of it's taken up in rent, insurance, glassware, and lemon wheels. Does that make sense? So if you don't have all that math, which we rarely do in this sort of setting, you just need to know your target so that you have the dollars to accommodate those other expenses. Because if you also said, whether it's you, the owner, or a bar manager or bartender, if you said, hey, figure out what to charge for this cocktail, and they said, I need to know what we pay in rent and electric, right? It just wouldn't be reasonable. It would just stop. It'd be like, well, I don't know what to charge. We'll just give it away then. So this is giving you a structure to work with what you know. And then there's industry averages, not just on prices, not just, what does it cost? What is this cocktail, the Jerry, which nobody else knows? What does that cost in the industry? I can't get that answer, but I can say, I could look up what do bars in the Midwest operate on as an average for beverage cost. I can find that. So this is taking the known things that we can put together. I know what it costs to buy the ingredients. Even if I haven't bought them yet, I can look up the price of these things. And I know what my average wants to be. And maybe I need to be above average or below average. So the difference between 20% cost or 25% cost is a strategic decision. But I can find those information out much more than I can find out all the detailed operating expenses for the company that are going to be put to work to serve that cocktail or make that beer. Now, what I was saying before about that depends on the size and age of the company. Is a chain restaurant with 100 units probably has their operating expenses figured out and has a much more detailed view of why their margins are where they are. They're going to be able to speak to that in a detailed way because they have a room full of people managing costs. The independent entrepreneur doesn't have that information, but they can, that doesn't mean we go blind and we just, we're just using broader strokes in certain areas. Does that make sense? So just going to do a little review here. So some objectives and what we want to know for understanding the numbers when we're understanding pricing is we want to be able to determine price from cost with a desired markup or margin. So that's one direction, saying if I know what it costs, I can determine a target price. Then we want to analyze margin from a target selling price and determine a target cost. So I want to be $10.99. I want to be $9.99, going the other direction and say, okay, well, what would that need to be priced to retail? What would that need to be priced to wholesaler? What would that need to mean late in an FOB? Can I go backwards and understand what would need to happen to hit a market price. And then can I identify, the margins that I want to make per product, per package, per venue? Can I generate a gross margin per unit to assure appropriate pricing? So these identify and generate are kind of before and after, whether you've sold it or not. It's whether you've established the price. So those are just different ways to look at the same thing. Is do I know where I want to be, and do I know where this thing is landing? And then you can make changes to get where you want to be. And then being prepared to forecast revenue by product, by package, and time period. So can I create a system that says I have these 10 products and these 2 or 3 different packages? I expect to sell this amount of them times this price each month. And again, some of this is coming up in distribution and branding. It won't all be forecasting, but we'll cover that a little bit more. But this is your objective in terms of what this week is for, is like, if you understand these ingredients, then we're going to put them together and say, and now we can forecast because I understand pricing and dividing it by package and even customer type. And I can create a spreadsheet that'll give me that answer per month based on a projected volume. And, forecasting, we'll get into it later, but it's guessing. So it can create a little pressure or stress because you're like, how am I going to know? Well, you got to start somewhere. And so the reality is you won't know if your forecast is wrong if you didn't put it in there. So that difference between reality and forecast becomes very valuable because you can revise, and then that means your forecast keeps getting more and more accurate. So just a little empathy from me in terms of starting out those numbers is sometimes daunting. So, and then being able to provide margin analysis or projected profit in different ways as a selling tool to any venue. So for instance, the draft calculator, the cocktail calculator, I'm able to demonstrate to a customer their profit per glass, per keg, per cocktail, so that they can tell what they're going to make. And then comparative revenue margin in marketplace is being able to go out there and understand how you're going to compete in the marketplace based on prices on the shelf. All beer, all spirits are not sold at one price. There's tiers and there's shifts per producers, per region. And so being able to survey a retailer and understand what you're looking at and how it relates to your product is found in these skills and these details. Anything there? All right.
Fred,
I'm
do these look like quiz questions to you, or is that?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm not overthinking that.
No, I think that if, the text that hits the slide is the most likely to be drawn from for quizzes. So bullet points like this are definitely things that I want you to register as important features. And usually, I mean, I don't know, I'm sure you guys have figured out some of my approach by now. It's like the stuff off the slide, I'm trying to use as a way to support understanding what's on the slide. So we'll go into more depth. We'll cover a few different examples. We'll go different directions. But generally, the facts and the structure is in the slide if you're preparing for a quiz. I'm not going to guarantee that means I won't ask something that wasn't directly spelled out, but that's the target. That's the most likely material. And then I don't know what else I have to say about that other than that's a good way to prepare. And I reserve the right to be tricky.
I got a question, Fred.
Yes.
is Excel like good enough to run your own business off of? I mean, I guess what did we do before Excel? Back before Windows 98. I mean, what
Yeah.
um,
Well, I would say that generally speaking, these days you could use Excel for accounting. It's sort of cumbersome but it's certainly doable. But there's much better products out there for running your books and your accounting. More than ever. Excel is plenty powerful to do forecasting. There will be points in a company's history where certain things you'd want to move into a database. And there's just some differences between, spreadsheet logic and database logic in terms of how it moves. But I mean, you can do massively complex spreadsheets. So, we're not going to get there in this class, but I mean, I will also qualify. So you asked a question that I could probably go on for about an hour because I'm a bit of for years I was a very heavy Excel user, and it was especially back in the early days when that was all we had, but it was magical. But you can create very robust interlinked tabs in a sheet and linking formulas, and whether that being forecasting volume or managing pricing. It can be very powerful. So my caveat that I wanted to add is Google Sheets is not the same, like online is not the same as Excel sheet on your desktop. A lot of the functionality is stripped away to have a shareable sheet online. And so that's really handy for simple things and for collaborating, for like, when I don't know, just keep track of something simple. But if you want linked sheets and all the complex formulas that Excel can do, don't expect that to survive an upload to the web. So those are two very different things.
Hey, Edwin, coming from a son of a very good CPA and everything, before Excel and everything, there was this word they used called a contometer. My dad had that thing. It was very loud. It was hand operated. You pulled the lever. It kept me up till 3 o'clock many mornings. Noisy.
okay.
Just saying.
Yeah. So, and I remember I didn't have a contometer, but when I learned to sell beer regionally to distributors, we didn't have computers. You did the forecasting you did on a legal pad with columns and did the math and sat in the meeting and took the order. And our big advance was that we had fax machines. So you'd fax it to the brewery and away you went. But it was all doable. It was the same logic. It just took longer and was harder to communicate. But nobody knew the difference. So that was the acceptable timeline then. But Excel, can do things. It's plenty powerful for the behind the scenes. And I wish I don't have the words for explaining. Maybe I'll get them. But the difference between database is, records you can have a little more, identify certain parts of your data that you want to be fixed and relating on an ongoing basis to changing things. So like having a brew log that's logging costs and logging numbers for taxes and going in several different directions and being able to identify this fixed behind the scenes part of the system, and then the user interface where they enter this one component of a larger deal and can compile it and send it to multiple places. That is beyond a spreadsheet. That's database. And one can do a lot of things that a database does in a spreadsheet, but they're the ones moving the numbers here and there versus the system doing it on your behalf. And that's sort of a, I don't know, dollar store explanation of it, but we're not getting into databases. And typically these days it's probably different with the apps getting smaller. And I think we talked about this on the tax discussion, but there's more and more apps available that would provide that to a small brewery. But it's typically a leap for a startup. But for our purposes, we're going to be doing sort of sample level things. And I will show you how that can work in Excel. And maybe you guys could give me an idea maybe each of you could share, what would you describe your Excel capabilities to be, like beginner, intermediate, advanced?
I would say at one point I was an advanced user. I come from an engineering background, and back in the 90s, there was automating calculations, and there was a point where engineers could build their own tools and Visual Basic and all that. And it's changed a lot from then. So things are now apps, and things are all quality controlled now, and the engineers can't build their own tools anymore. So
Yeah. Anybody else?
That's why they have tool makers. Because you engineers need heroes. I'm just saying.
Is that
Yeah.
when you say a cell, is that like an accelerator, like ACCEL, or I'm not sure. I would say I'm a pre-beginner. I think I used that a couple times 25 years ago, but those spreadsheets just I need like graphs and line graphs, bar graphs, pie charts, things like that to understand any of that kind of thing.
Yeah. EXCEL, Microsoft Office. So that's good to know.
Yeah, this is Jim. I would say intermediate to advanced, and Frank, Excel's perfect if you want graphs and charts. Very, very simple and easy to make pretty much everything you want.
Yeah. And when we talk about, Excel sheets, they're the columns and rows that hold the numbers that would create a graph. Oh, you're muted, Richard.
I would say I'm intermediate to advanced.
Okay.
Beginner to intermediate. I use it for payroll, but our staff is really small, and so it's not that complicated. The formulas aren't very complex, and at this point, I just drag the formulas down, and so I I don't even know what's in there anymore. I just mostly have to type things in these days. The different sheets already talk to each other, so yeah, intermediate, not more than.
So you're working in established sheets versus creating them.
I've created a few to improve upon it, but yeah, I was given a few sheets when I started doing payroll. So
Great.
Yeah, I'd say I'm an intermediate at Excel. I actually work for a company that's trying to get off of a lot of Excel spreadsheets that have logged things over time and move all that data into databases so that we can actually work with it a lot better.
Yeah.
We found that databases can do some really cool things that Excel spreadsheets can't, like generate reports, run queries. Well, I think you can run a query in Excel, but just work with the data a little better than you could in an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, I'd say I'm pretty close to advanced.
Okay.
Been a few years, but I used to build macros to pull a lot of data through.
Great. And I thought of what I wanted to say about databases and spreadsheets, and I'm not an expert in databases other than using some of them and hiring, bringing them into our systems, recognizing that difference. And spreadsheets are largely, not largely, they're built on rows and columns. So you can do a ton of different things in terms of referencing back to this cell from that sheet, but it's identified as its column and its row. It's a grid-based collection of data. where database is not dependent on that column and row. It's identifying records uniquely and then being able to have all these different relationships with it. So that was part I couldn't come up with earlier. And if that helps, we're not going to be studying. That's not on the test. And the other reality we used to talk about is database needs a programmer. Excel being the brand, a spreadsheet doesn't. You can have all these different levels and there's a bunch of horsepower once you learn how to do certain things. And yet you can operate it very simply and have a column, and a row that says, I brought in this much and I spent this much. That's pretty easy to do. So it's available regardless of your expertise to do what your expertise will allow.
I would say I'm advanced. I've crashed many of them.
Excellent. And a database, one can learn how to program, but it's not the average user. It ain't me. All right. So the next slide is really just talking about looking ahead over the next few weeks. So if you got any questions about working the numbers, what we covered today, margin, pricing, etc., now's the time to ask. Other than that, I'll preview the upcoming weeks and then we'll call it a night. So I'll put this on the screen again. So next week, we're going to have quiz number 3, which will cover division of labor and business plans. And assignment number 3, which is creating a pitch deck based on that branding and experience, will be assigned and then due the following week. Week 11, we'll cover sales and distribution. So quiz number 4 will cover business plans and working the numbers. Nope, we had that'll cover branding and working the numbers. Sorry, business plans is in there twice. So I got to rework this a little bit. But they'll happen in these weeks. What they cover will, you're not going to cover business plans twice. So we'll get that fixed. And then brand and package forecast is assigned in week 11. And then we've got quiz number 5. We'll cover hospitality. Then we'll have a week of review of business plans and questions and any housekeeping, and some continued preparation for the final. Then week 14, you'll be each presenting your business plans. And week 15 will be the final. So that needs a little tweak in the coverage, and I'll get that done and get this posted the next day or so. Does that make sense to everybody? Other than some of the coverage there that that I'm adapting on the fly. So I think in terms of your ongoing group project, if my advice would be to realize that the nuts and bolts are going to be coming after these sections. So look at that calendar and think about, what do you want to wait for and what do you want to do now? But understanding, the basics of mission and vision. What do we want to accomplish? What do we want this business to look like? Getting that done now will then help you lay in. Now, how do we put that into the nuts and bolts? How do our nuts and bolts reflect that goal, backwards and forwards? And then each week you'll get a little more information on how to actually put numbers and words to it. Make sense? All right. Well, that's it then. Have a great night. And we'll see you next week.
Have a good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night, everybody.